Just give us some bloody answers. Or continue these stories. You know, whatever way you want to do it. Let's look at 10 Star Trek storylines begging to be continued. Don't forget to check out the original article over on whatculture.com, and thank you so much to Mel Braun, who is the poor editor who had to turn this into an actual video. Number 10. Who the hell was the future guy? Star Trek Enterprise introduced the idea of the temporal Cold War in its pilot episode Broken Bow. A mysterious figure was shown issuing commands to the Suliban, a race that had begun genetic engineering on itself, aided with future technology. The temporal Cold War plotline was certainly interesting, but as the show went on, the producers began to feel that it was wearing thin. The Xindi arc was introduced to shake things up, but the plot thread still hung there, unplucked. Stormfront, the opening two-parter of the show's final season, was intended to cap this storyline off, with vampire space Nazis to boot. The plotline received a dab squib of an ending, with no true resolution. However, as time has gone on, it's become one of Enterprise's more memorable mysteries. The identity of the future guy was never revealed. Various sources have claimed it would turn out to be Captain Archer, or a Romulan agent of the future. With Discovery's teasing of both the temporal wars and Carl, it actually seems a perfect time to revisit this arc, reveal the identity of this temporal trickster, and tie the two shows together nicely. Or they could just give us that 5th season of Enterprise. I would also accept that. Number 9. Who sent the Doomsday Machine? The Doomsday Machine is, in this writer's opinion, one of the strongest episodes of the original series. It's simply Moby Dick in space, and the simplicity gives it so much of its power. The Planet Killer is fascinating both for its immense destructive capabilities and the shroud of mystery as to its origin. The episode's close sees it drained of all power, and there the story ends. We sure hope no one decides to send another one. Therein lies the potential for the story to continue. There have been a few suggestions as to where it came from, and the measures put in place to block it. The game Star Trek Starfleet Academy suggests that the galactic barrier was erected to prevent these things from entering the Milky Way galaxy. Author Peter David also posited that they were constructed to fight the Borg, created by the Preservers, the race first mentioned in the Paradise Syndrome. This already shows that there's far more to this story than has yet been told. Arguably, Star Trek Discovery's 4th season touched on something similar with the 10C. However, we feel that where the 10C were ignorant of their destructive power, whoever created the Planet Killer was fully aware of what they were doing. A species as powerful and malevolent as this, wouldn't that be a frightening story to be told? Number 8. Did DRAYLON 2 live up to the hype? In the 2nd season episode of DS9, Sanctuary, the Skrean refugees arrive from the Gamma Quadrant, having been displaced by the Dominion. Initially, their leader Hanek strikes up a friendship with Major Kira and begins to believe that Bajor will be the new home for the millions of refugees arriving. It doesn't take long for this hope to sour. The Bajoran government turns down their application, believing they would be too much of a drain on resources. Sisko and Dax, having studied several potential worlds, decide that DRAYLON 2 is the best candidate for resettlement. The Skreans, having come to believe that Bajor was their new prophesized home, feel betrayed, but accept the new planet. Flash forward another 3 years, and the Dominion invade the Alpha Quadrant with the help of the Cardassian Union. Were the Skreans caught up in the crossfire? Did their new safe haven become one of the many casualties of the war? We can only imagine how they must have felt, rebuilding thousands of light years from home, listening to the news network announcing the outbreak of war. Number 7. What happened to Commander SELA? A frequent flyer on lists begging for stories to continue is of course the wonderful SELA, as played by Denise Crosby. She was set up to become a major player in Star Trek until she was tricked by a hologram and nerve pinched by Data. The end. I'm sorry, what? She had enough experience and savvy to rise through the Romulan military, Romulans who are of course famously closed off and not a little xenophobic, so as a half-human, SELA's rise is seriously impressive. Still, for more than 30 years, the audience has been left wondering what happened to her after Picard, Data and Spock escaped her clutches. It's highly possible she was executed and, at the very least, stripped of rank. Star Trek Online saw her return, and quite frankly, it was written brilliantly. It brings the Romulan supernova into the story, revealing that it was SELA herself who was responsible. With so much exploration of the Romulan Free State post-explosion, it seemed a certainty that she would feature in Picard. Alas, it was not to be. That does, however, leave Lower Decks and Prodigy in a position to pick up this thread. At the very least, on screen, we feel that the final scene the character received was far too ignoble a closing for her. She was set up to be a fantastic villain, so we feel that her capacity for this should be explored. Now, if there was to be a Star Trek Legacy series, there's your first big bad right there. Number 6. What happened to the Ocampa? The Ocampa were a race with a fascinating premise. They're a species who are like the mayfly, born born, they live short lives, and then they die. So how does one appreciate life when time is a constant presence? Unfortunately, and we don't feel that this is a controversial statement here, that premise was never properly explored. Kes was our viewpoint character, and the writers simply didn't give her anything to do. Caretaker and Coldfire are truly the only episodes that explore the Ocampa and their relationship with the Sporocystian life forms, but the race as a whole was left to fend for itself after the Caretaker's death, with enemies surrounding them in the form of the Kazon, yet with both advanced technology and the capacity for potentially dangerous telekinetic powers. What would the Ocampa become when they inevitably are forced to leave their homeworld? Perhaps the ho-hum episode Fury was a taste of this. Kes returns, filled with misplaced rage, intent on taking her younger self away from Voyager. If Kes, someone who lived and loved on the ship for years, could turn so hateful toward them, what would the Ocampa themselves become? There is a very real chance, with time as short as it is, they could effectively become warlords of the Delta Quadrant. It's a story that begs exploration, for though we didn't see nearly enough of them in the series, these magical mayflies may actually be one of Star Trek's most fascinating species. Number 5. Species 8472. Species 8472, or the Undine if we follow their designation in Star Trek Online, were last seen coming to an understanding with the crew of Voyager after preparing for an all-out invasion of the Federation. Rather than explore a war between Starfleet and Species 8472, we feel that enough time has passed to see a genuine alliance build between both powers. CGI technology has also come on in leaps and bounds since their first appearance, which was quite impressive for the time. For several reasons, the conclusion to Species 8472's story left us wanting more. Here was a race that put in the time and effort to mimic Starfleet officers and cadets, to reproduce Starfleet Academy to an almost perfect level, including Boothby, and by the episode's close, came to an understanding with humanity that the invasion would be postponed pending review. Well, here we are more than 20 years later in real time, so we guess the review went well. Similar to other entries on this list, there is a distinctly unfinished feel to their story. Did every member simply say, okay then, when it was announced that hostilities would cease? What are the family units like in their world? How many of them lost loved ones to the modified nanoprobes? With the increased threats to Starfleet, like the Romulans, the Borg, and the Packleds, what would an envoy to fluidic space look like now? Would they be welcomed with open limbs? Number 4. The VIDIIANS post-phage. So, sorry about that whole organ theft thing. We cool? One can only imagine that awkward conversation. Star Trek Voyager's episode Think Tank reveals that the phage has been cured in the VIDIIAN people, which means they are finally freed of their horrific wasting disease and able to stop attacking passers-by, stealing their organs to survive. Star Trek Prodigy is now exploring the Delta Quadrant, but consider this. What would a VIDIIAN settlement look like now? We don't necessarily mean what wonderful advancements have they made. We mean, has the rest of the quadrant hunted them down and exterminated them yet? Perhaps this sounds rather harsh, but think of it from everyone else's point of view. These vampires have been a blight on the quadrant for decades. Oh, they're cured. Oh, lovely, all is forgiven. Much like several early Voyager plotlines, this was a fantastic and fertile ground for storytelling, was just sort of forgotten as time went on. We do see them again in the 6th season episode Fury, but as this is time travel, it doesn't really count. The VIDIIANS were driven by desperation to survive. Once that catalyst for their actions has been removed, what are they as a people? Are they now the greatest medical power in the galaxy? Do they continue, having gained a taste for terror? The return of the VIDIIANS seems a perfect story to drop several young, naive people into. We don't wish them any harm, but that Borg episode was quite fun, so why not organ vampires? Number 3. The mysterious Breen. What's really under those helmets? So far in Star Trek, the Breen have never removed their helmets on screen. There are some characters who must know what they look like. Both Gul Dukat and Colonel Kira sourced Breen uniforms, but neither ever described what they found. Beta Canon actually explains a little about the Breen. Zero Sum Game by David Mack reveals that the Breen are not entirely the same. In fact, they're something of a cooperative of differing races and species, wearing these uniforms to hide their differences. That would make them, at least in part, like the Xindi. While the Xindi don't mask their differences, there are 5 separate races, 6 if you count the extinct avians. Other than this Beta Canon reveal, next to nothing is known about the Breen. Who are they, really? Why did they side with the Dominion during the war? Chancellor Martok reveals that a fleet of Klingon ships was once sent to invade their homeworld and never returned. There has been enough intrigue with these mysterious warriors that a deeper dive into their origins or organizational structure would be fascinating. By the 32nd century, what does the Breen Confederacy look like? Do they still hide their appearances, or have they learned to live in the light? And just what the hell does all of that shrill barking actually mean? Number 2. Captain 7 of 9. This is an obvious one, and also one that the fandom seems very much behind. The final scenes of Star Trek Picard show us Captain 7 of 9 commanding the Enterprise G. Now, whether you agree that the Titan A should have been renamed or not, this immediately leaves the door open to an entirely new era of storytelling. Seven's journey from liberated drone and Voyager successor to Fenris Ranger and Starfleet officer in Picard, has already allowed fans to enjoy Jerry Ryan's range as an actor, yet there is so much more to do. With the events of the last generation as they were, can we expect all Starfleet officers to simply forgive and forget when it comes to the younger officers who, despite their control being taken away, were presumably responsible for the deaths of thousands of people? Added to this is a former drone as captain of the Enterprise. There is a wealth of stories to explore here, not least the growth and understanding that goes all the way back to Gene Roddenberry's core tenets of Star Trek. While we can't imagine this series will be devoid of interpersonal conflict, the inevitable march to unity, pun intended, would make for a fascinating watch, not least in these highly divided times in the real world. Number 1. Do the short treks count? The short treks were, and hopefully will be again, a highly fun experiment in quick storytelling for this franchise. Some stood out over others. The Trouble with Edward takes the rare trip into outright comedy, while Ephraim and Dot gives us a quick run-through of Star Trek history. Oh, and then Calypso shatters our hearts in a mere 15 minutes. Zora has been teased in seasons 3 and 4 of Discovery, but the version we saw in Calypso has yet to appear. There is only one season remaining of Discovery, so either the clock's beginning to run out, or there may be another short trek on the horizon. We can dream, can't we? With Calypso, the short treks offered us a fascinating tale of love and loss, all of which is managed by two characters we had, at that point, never met before. While the setting was familiar, everything else had to be managed on the fly, so to speak. While the result was a beautiful minisode, we can't abide this being the last time it's visited. If it is simply Calypso that gets a continuation, or we get another full round of short treks, this is a wonderful gamble of an idea that deserves to be revisited, fleshed out, and continued on an annual basis. That's everything for our list. Thank you very much, folks. Is there any storyline that you reckon is begging to be continued? You let us know in the comments below. Thank you so much again to the wonderful Mel who turned my crazy words into something actually watchable. To everyone listening, Slava Ukrainian. Thanks very much, everyone. Look after yourselves. Love.